Last speaker before we go, Cameron McIntyre, who was on the writing committee, which was established by the CCA. Cameron's just going to give a brief outline. Cameron, we're getting a bit short, so you're on about 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Good morning, everyone. I wasn't going to speak, then just tried to get the computer. I got fired up. I pulled this book out where I've been going to the meeting since. The notes covered from probably the first meeting we had that where I met Norman down at Armadale, Paradise Lagoons, and then things started to get a little bit on the move, and there was a meeting organised by the MLA in September 2011. No matter what they tried to do there, the meeting kept going back. There was a big cross-section of producers, there was feedlotters, processors and so on there. Don Heatley was chairman, along with the new CEO, Scott Hanson. They stated that the MLA would like to step back from any policy setting and any role spoken to the industry in any shape or form. So they should have, because they've just been through that live export debacle, and they tried to be spoken to the industry, but of course they didn't do a very good job, so suddenly they didn't want to do it. But no matter what happened that day, the whole meeting wanted to discuss the lack of direction from the Cattle Council of Australia. Greg Brown, the ex-chairman at that time, said he admitted there was no direction coming out of CCA because of the lack of resources, and he identified clearly that they weren't seen as an advocacy group because of this reason. Well, following on from there was a MLA meeting at Longreach. That's 18 months ago. At that meeting, Graham Acton and myself were invited to address the Cattle Council of Australia. We got a good hearing. And afterwards there was a strong agreement from the floor and across all parties that major change was needed in the representative structure. We spoke to people around there, and Cattle Council led us to believe that there would definitely be a review of the industry. Following that, we had a meeting in Brisbane with the CCA representatives, Greg Brown, David Inall, Peter Hall and Jed Max. There was about 6 or 8 of us there from the AMPG, and once again we got a very good hearing. My notes, the thing that stuck out from my notes, that they stated very clearly that they were going to start with a blank sheet of paper, and that there was a time frame of 3 to 4 months before some solid position would emerge. That was the notes I was given, and Jed would have to concur with that. That gave me a bit of heart. I thought, well, if they're going to start with a blank sheet of paper, they're prepared to listen, we're prepared to work together, and we're all in this together. The one charter that did come out from the AMPG was that it was not about tipping the industry upside down, but more about effective representation for all the levy payers. Following that, we had a meeting in Canberra, and I was invited down there, and there's a big cross-section of industry from all the states. Processors, once again, a lot of the big companies were represented, or all the big companies were represented, and there was a good cross-section of smaller producers, and a good percentage of the Cattle Council members were there. As a result of that meeting, which just went on discussion, there's a lot of interesting notes to see what I've taken the other day, because they're all about the issues we've talked here today. But a writing group was formed, and they include Andrew Oakley, who's present with us, Apple Economy, Tony McCormack, the CEO of Stanbro, John Wild and myself. We were asked after the meeting to put in submissions and meet again in Canberra. General consensus at that meeting, which Andrew chaired, other than we couldn't get any agreement at all out of John Wild, he hung out all day, but we did agree reach a general consensus, and incidentally John Wild didn't put in a submission, and he didn't bother to show or take any more interest after the process following on from that, because he didn't get his way. We then had a meeting in Brisbane following that, where we discussed all our options and so on, and came up and put a bit more meat into the thing. And just out of interest, some of the people at the next meeting in Brisbane were John Berry from JBS Whip, Ian McCamley, a well-respected member of Ag Force in Queensland, Ross Kane from the Red Meat Advisory Council, Paul Holmes of Court, Graham Acton, Norman Hunt, Ashley McIntyre, Michael Spencer from AA Company, John McDonald from Binder Red Beef, David Inall, the ex-CEO of Cattle Council, Jed Max, Peter Hall, who was head of Ag Force cattle in Queensland, Greg Brown, Alistair Irving, Andrew Oakley, and a few others. At that meeting, there was representatives from across Australia and many of the, as I said, many of the big companies. ABA was also there and cross-section of smaller producers. We debated the design of the various models we put up, and the greatest support was obviously for option C right, which was based around a smaller elected board, democratically elected, with a balance between large and small producers. And that's where the model that Norman just spoke about, with the two-tiered board, seemed to fall into place. And if we take the one very strong point that was made that day, and we had the CEOs of Stanbroke, AA Company, NAPCO, Caraway and so on, and they all argued very strongly that a board should not be made up of any more than 8 to 10 members, because it just becomes workable beyond that. And they were very experienced people that had a lot of history on board, and they were adamant, and we seemed, in my opinion, to waste a fair bit of time, but they were definite that there shouldn't be any more than 10 on it. A strong push was then made for the CCA to take charge of. The other point I'm going to make was, the thing that came out that day was, there was a strong push for the Cattle Council of Australia to take charge of $56 million levy, and they took that in hand and then allocated directly how that was spent, and there was all sorts of discussions about where it would go, but basically it got back to the idea that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And I remember Peter, you standing up and speaking passionately about that there that day, and I went down and congratulated him. I said, for the first time I've actually heard you speak up and make some definite statement about the industry. There was also a good deal of support for one species, as in just a body that represented the grass-fed beef industry. But of course that ran into issues because of the involvement in the sheep producers in the state farm organisations. It appeared then, because there was no inherent plan in this, to preserve the state farm organisations and preserve their majority of any say in option C light or anything like it. Our option was just given to sweep it under the carpet by the Cattle Council of Australia. Our riding group was rubbed out informally without any recognition of the work we had done. I was very disillusioned after that and sort of walked away from it. I was then interested to hear months later where a new group was formed by the Cattle Council of Australia. Interestingly, it is now chaired by John Wild, whose views didn't get a start with the majority of the first group. And the majority of the rest of the group was appointed by Cattle Council of Australia, with their main criteria appearing to be that they were people who were well versed in the history of the state farm organisations and will never rock the boat. Linda, they couldn't have put you in charge of this. But I'll debate all day, and that was basically the criteria, and it's a matter of, if we can't get the result from the people who are there, we'll keep changing the people until we get the result we want. We now find ourselves 18 months later with a new plan that is utterly hopeless. Imagine even considering selling a position on the board. To talk about a democracy, as someone told me who's in the room, the French Revolution was found about this idea that there was no saying they cut people's heads off. And here in this day and age, when we talk about putting a body there to represent and re-franchise all the levy payers, that we're going to offer a seat to AA Company and the people that can afford. The amount of money, I've heard something around 25,000 whatever, but it would be a big amount of money. And you imagine how that would sit with the medium-sized producers in this country, where there's people there making decisions about our board, spending our money when they bought that seat on the board. I've never heard anything less democratically and more ridiculous and insulting all my life. The new representative structure should clearly be designed around what is needed to save our industry going forward for the next 20 years, and not built around preserving the state farm organisations. We need a body that can actively lobby for us. The recent issue of the car industry, they don't produce anything like we do as value of product to the nation. They get hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidy. They're all over the press. And where was our Cattle Council of Australia? They've got no resources. They haven't got the people there to do the work. They should have been there with the car manufacturers and saying, yes, Miss Prime Minister or Ms. or whatever she is, we suffer the same problems as the car industry. We've got the high dollar, we've got the high cost of labour, we've got the appendix cost of inspections back to us, We've got all the tariffs in the world against us. We've got an issue going on in Korea where each year we're getting further behind. Not a word. And this is the sort of body that we need to represent us and take it forward. However, just scribble these days. I believe that we should be able to have a well-resourced body, we're totally in that should be able to focus on the commercial outcomes, and rather than conducting the business with all the field deals about WWF and sustainability and so on. Those things are by the way. If we're going to do something about the commercial situation of our industry, we won't be here in 5 years to talk about dealing with the WWF. Another thing back. The state farm organisations are no longer relevant in this age of modern communication. They were designed when my grandfather went to the Sultanville meeting. 3 months later, the message came back from Brisbane. With all our modern communication, we need to be proactive and make instant decisions. I reiterate they are certainly needed in the states and to deal with state issues. We cannot build a new structure around preserving them. For example, when we try to talk about a single species for grass-fed beef or whatever, it gets rolled because the sheep producers want to swing in and get a cut of this 56 million and run around backs. In this day and age, we are actually competitors of sheep. That was clearly identified, but the minute we talk about doing anything, it gets swamped when it gets back to cattle council because of the sheep producers involved. Finally, wrapping up, I believe from the deals I've seen and what's going on in the progress that hasn't been made, we need a whole of industry review. Why should the Red Meat Advisory Council, which is ultimately the spokesman that gives advice to the minister, when that live export thing was on, RMAC had their hands tied because the processors wouldn't give consensus to any policy unless there's 100% consensus from the lot feeders, from the beef producers, from the processors and so on. RMAC, the main body that's meant to speak to the minister, sits on their hands and say nothing. So that was a perfect example of how it's never going to work. So if we're going to go forward and build this body, there needs to be a review across the whole of the industry, and I firmly believe it's got to be an independent review by a non-aligned body that answers to a task force appointed by the minister and after taking advice from the whatever. And I believe that this task force must be answerable to the minister and not the Cattle Council of Australia. Thanks for your attention.